we're going to go over copepods and Diphanosoma, in part because Diphanosoma is a crowd favorite. People really like that species, and I think it displays to you guys the best the complexity of zooplankton. I think sometimes we just kind of lump them all together and we don't really understand them as species. We're going to cover a few of the common freshwater invertebrates. We're not going to get too heavy into the detail, but if you guys are interested in that work, I can direct you to people who actually do that work for their thesis, and you guys might be able to get some research in there. We'll cover lightly some freshwater fish and then the river continuum concept. So as he said, we'll have like the little stars. They'll be either in the top left or right corner. So just like keep an eye out for that. We'll have the problem set due. And then I wanted to give you guys a project reminder. I want to say thank you for everyone that was able to meet with me. I think that not just helped you guys, but also helped me like know where you're at with it, and what I can do more for you. And so you have that first draft due in 2 weeks, but don't forget that's not the first time I have to look at it. So if you guys get something rolling next week, shoot it to me. I'll give it a quick read over and give you guys some feedback back. I know some of you guys were having issues seeing your annotated bibs. So that actually wasn't an US Blackboard issue. That was a nationwide Blackboard issue, and it should be fixed now. So you should be able to go back in and see your comments. So just if you're interested in that. Okay. So zooplankton. So I kind of want to gauge, what do you guys already know? So what are zooplankton? How would you characterize them?
Aren't they heterotrophic because they eat phytoplankton?
Yeah, they're heterotrophic. They eat phytoplankton. What else? Like when you guys think of zooplankton, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I know it's been a while, but I need y'all to participate. Come on.
I mean, I think of how they feed a lot of other organisms.
Yeah, they feed a lot of other organisms, right? And they're super small. So if you're looking at these pictures here, these are all under a microscope. So these are some of the ones that I see commonly in my samples. You have to look through a microscope to find them. They're really abundant in our samples. I can count anywhere from 100 to 200 in a sample. So to formally define that for you guys, zooplankton are heterotrophic plankton. So does anyone know what a plankton is? Because I think this is something that never really got across to me when I was an undergrad. So plankton is just a very small organism in the water. Okay, and usually it has either no swimming capabilities or very, very weak swimming capabilities. And so it just kind of drifts with the water. Zooplankton are able to do diurnal migration. So they're able to swim weakly and move up and down in the water column based on light signals that they receive with their eye spots. But other than that, they just kind of flow with things, which sounds like a kind of a nice way to live. So zooplankton is broken up into two meanings. So you have zoon, which means animals, and planktos, which means wanderer or drifter. Just because you're a zooplankton for part of your life doesn't mean you have to be a zooplankton for all of your life. So there's meroplankton and then there's holoplankton. Meroplankton are things like trophophores, so clam larvae. And so they will be considered a zooplankton for part of their life cycle until they settle. And then you have things like fish larvae. They are actually considered zooplankton because they're heterotrophic and they're very small and they have this weak swimming capability. And then you have things like what we traditionally think of as zooplankton. So this is actually a parasitic zooplankton that is found in the gills of fish. And so it attaches there and feeds off the fish for most of its life cycle. So the ones that I really wanted to cover were copepods, because those are the ones that people usually think about most. They're really important for early fish life cycles. So we have Cyclopodia, and then we have Calanodia. These are the two that I see quite frequently in my samples. They're really cool when you see them. So Calanodia have these huge long antennae that sometimes you see when you're scanning before you even see the copepod itself. The subclass of copepods tends to eat mostly phytoplankton, but actually larger Calanodia eat other zooplankton, which makes we typically think of like zooplankton as one trophic level, but it can kind of make it more complex when you have these interactions. You also have benthic copepods, which can be really important for nutrient cycling because they're eating detritus and bacteria. And so if you have changes in the abundance of your benthic copepods, it can actually alter your nutrient cycling in the system. Okay, so I just want to go over briefly what the life cycle of a copepod looks like. So it can range from 3 weeks to a year. They are also really interesting because they can exhibit diapause, which makes their dynamics a little bit more complicated. Does anyone know what diapause is? Have you come across that term before? So it's where you actually can stop your life cycle. So they stop it in the egg phase, and these eggs can basically settle out. And then once environmental conditions are just right again, they'll hatch. And so environmental cues could be lack of food, it could be inclement weather, issues in temperature, things like that. So that's why you can have zooplankton die-offs and then sudden like batches come back up again. And this is really large in estuarine systems where you have environments that are really variable. But we see it in other freshwater systems as well. So you have the eggs, they're actually carried on the copepodia. So you can see in this picture here, she has 2 very large egg sacs. Calanodia only have 1. And then you have the embryo, it hatches. It actually goes through 5 molts, very similar to a crab in the napulus stage. And then it turns into a copepod larva. It goes through 5 molts again, and then it is an adult. Makes sense? Any questions? Any questions about diapause? Because I think that's really cool.
What stage of their life cycle do they do that, or can it just happen at any point?
Only at the egg.
Cool.
Yeah. So it's kind of like stuck in that.
Hey, Kay, I'm
Yep.
sorry. Alicia says she can't see anything you're screen sharing.
Are we supposed to be seeing something right now? Because you were referencing like a picture, but I can't see anything but your screen right now.
Is anyone else having that problem?
Yeah, I'm just following along with the PowerPoint like online.
Okay, so no one can see. Okay, one second.
I can see it fine. I can see the
I
life
can see it.
Okay.
I see it now. I just needed to mess with something. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
No, it's okay. I'd rather you ask than just sit there staring at my face.
Yeah.
I was a little confused.
Yeah. No, the life cycle isn't in my eyes. Makes me excited, but okay. So yeah. So now you can see like the 5 different molts going on. It's really interesting. So they add body elements as they molt. So it's kind of like if you were thinking about like Mr. Potato Head, like you can add pieces on. It's kind of how it works when he molts. Okay. So Diphanosoma is one of my favorites. It kind of looks like something out of Harry Potter when you find it. And these are actual pictures. The top one is at least of some that I've found in the sample. So they actually display some size selection or discretion for different size particles. And so there's been experiments where they can go after specific particles based off of their organic compounds and based off of size. And so what do you guys think that means for an ecosystem? When you're thinking about organic matter and the water.
there's lots of different sizes of it.
Yeah, there's lots of different sizes. And so what do you think their size selection might affect? Because they're not just taking everything in.
The amount that they can take in.
Exactly. It affects the amount that they can take in, and it affects the amount that's available for others too. Because a lot of copepods filter feed. And so if you have a high abundance of Diphanosoma, it can actually shape your ecosystem a little bit. Additionally, they can be predators, right? And so if they are predators and they're eating some other things, you have some issues there as well. Okay, so we have parthenogenesis and then sexual reproduction. So parthenogenesis is actually the main form of reproduction for this species, which basically means that female Diphanosoma produce a female diploid egg, and that's it. So it's a one kind of loop cycle there. But then you can have these environmental stimuli that actually form it, where it makes the choice to do a sexual reproduction instead. So these environmental stimuli could again be something similar to diapause, where you have a disruption in temperature, all of a sudden food resources aren't good, and it chooses sexual reproduction because of like genetic variability would increase, which may allow the species to survive. Does that make sense? And I'm using a little bit of anthropomorphizing here to kind of make it a little bit more digestible. Like the Diphanosoma is not making the conscious decision, right? But it is receiving some sort of stimulus that is hinting at the plasticity. So the way it's turning on and turning off genes for it to then produce male diploid eggs, which will produce male diploids who produce haploid sperm. Other female Diphanosoma will produce haploid eggs. The haploid eggs combine with the haploid sperm to produce these female aphilial eggs. These female aphilial eggs kind of work like the diapause. So these eggs can sit and wait until conditions are right, and then they turn into female diploid eggs. And then parthenogenesis begins again. Any questions? Because this is a question on your problem set.
You mentioned before about, I think it was question 10, why does whether or not zooplankton displays size selection and discretion is important? And you mentioned something about it affects the amount that they can take in, and it also affects the amount that others can take in.
Yep.
I don't know if it was just the wording, but do they have like a sense of community and like understanding that they need to share?
No. So you got to
Okay.
think, like everyone's fighting for resources, right?
Yeah.
And so if I have the ability as a species to select something that is best for me, right? Like I am able to move enough that I am like, okay, that particle is the best particle ever. The other dude that's next to me, the other species next to me, who's just filter feeding, will not get that particle.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So it's definitely more competition.
Exactly. It gives them a competitive edge over other zooplankton.
Cool.
So
if they can exhibit size selection, they have an advantage.
yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Because they're not just sitting there and filter feeding. They're not just subject to whatever particles come their way. Because unlike fish, right, or amphibians, they don't move around. They don't really have that choice of direction because they can't freely swim. They can't freely move to another patch that would be better for them. So they just kind of drift and have to deal with the conditions that are around them. While Diphanosoma is able to at least have enough sensory reception that it can size select the particle, and it can be like, that particle is the better nutrition for me, giving them a competitive edge. Okay. Any questions about the life cycle of Diphanosoma? Do we understand what parthenogenesis is?
Yeah, I'm gonna be real. You're going a little fast for me.
No,
Could you
that's
maybe
okay.
like touch on question 11 again, please?
I don't have the questions in front of me, so just hit me with that question again.
Oh, sorry. It's you conduct a zooplankton tow and find Ephibium.
Yeah. So I'll go through the life cycle again, and I'll go through it a little slower.
Okay.
So parthenogenesis is basically a female produces a female. Okay. Asexual reproduction, no sperm, all ready to go. Egg pops out, turns into another female, and we keep that cycle going. And this usually arises when we have stable environmental conditions, because we don't really need to worry about genetic variation to allow the species to persist. At least that is the current hypothesis behind parthenogenesis, because it's a very novel way to reproduce. When you have an environmental stimulus, that is an indication and a change of condition, right? So all of a sudden temperatures are changing, something's not going to be constant. And so the current model of the person that exists, if we reproduce that, there's no guarantee that it will survive. Does that make sense? Okay, so the environmental stimulus happens. The organism picks up that environmental stimulus and begins to express genes that allows it to sexually reproduce. So now it's going to produce male diploid eggs, because it had those capabilities the entire time, produces these male diploid eggs. It forms a male diploid individual that then produces haploid sperm. And then the haploid eggs that are produced also by the Diphanosoma combine with that. So you have some genetic recombination now that produces female aphelial eggs. The aphelial eggs are basically the Diphanosoma's equivalent to a diapause, because it's saying, okay, the environmental conditions are not great. I can put these eggs on the floor. They're going to sit there for a while. When conditions are great again, they'll hatch, and then we'll go back to our regular parthenogenesis. Okay, which is real to me. I love it. I think this is like one of the coolest things, because it makes our job a little bit more complex when we're thinking about kind of our more charismatic species. So when we're thinking about fish and food availability, these changes and fluctuations in abundance of different zooplankton species shape larval fish survival.
So just to clarify, parthenogenesis only happens when there's an environmental stimulus to start it?
Parthenogenesis is when you're reproducing just female. And so that would be in constant conditions.
Okay.
But you would be correct in that there would have to be a stimuli that would allow you to go back to parthenogenesis, right? That would have the aphelial eggs hatch. Does that make sense?
I guess I'm just not really sure in the question where it's asking what something undergoing parthenogenesis could indicate what that means.
So if you're seeing epithelial eggs, right? Think about this cycle. Let's backtrack it. So what had to have happened for those eggs to form?
Would it be like an environmental stressor or something?
Exactly. Exactly.
Can
You need
say
an
the
environmental
eggs
stressor.
again?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was talking over someone.
Can
There
you
are comments, I'm sorry, in there as well. Lucas said stable environmental conditions.
Okay,
Just want to make sure they're not overlooked.
gotcha. What were you saying, Kylie?
so wait, what was that last word that you used? It started with an A. It was real long. It was weird. It was a part of their life cycle.
The epithelial eggs?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's at the bottom, like right next to the picture. I don't know if you can see the mouse.
I cannot see the mouse, but
Okay.
but I know where you're talking
Okay.
about. Thanks.
So yeah, it's a stressor, right? So you have to have a stressor for them to have processed the fact, parthenogenesis is not going to work anymore. We have to switch reproductive modes, okay? Are we good? Okay. So now, Alex, you can take over for macroinverts.
All right. So real quick, guys, and I'm going to try out this pointer tool. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So what do you guys know? Does anyone want to give me a definition for what a macroinvertebrate is?
You can see it with the naked eye.
Yes, it's an organism you can see with the naked eye, and it lacks a backbone, so has no vertebral column. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about aquatic macroinverts, mainly aquatic insects, and then we're going to go over, Kay's going to go over some crayfish. So I'm only asking you guys to know these to the order level because they get pretty tricky the further down you go. So this first one, Ephemeroptera, which is your mayflies. You've probably heard of these. So ephemera is Greek and it means short-lived. Ptera means wings or winged. And this reflects the short lifespan of adults. So the adult Ephemeroptera, generally they hatch in the spring or summer, pretty much all at once, and make pretty large swarms, and they only live about a day. These organisms are what we would classify as scrapers or collector-gatherers, and that depends on the exact species of Ephemeroptera, and maybe partially on the life stage. We'll get a little into that. But mainly they feed on algae, diatoms, or detritus. So the detritus would be more for your collector gatherers, and the algae and diatoms would be more your scrapers. So just as an for ID, they have 2 to 3. They don't always have this third one. They have 2 to 3 long tail filaments. You can see this one only has 2. And these are like your more juvenile, I would say. This one's probably like in the sub-imago, and we'll go through that in the next slide. And then this would be your adult. So you can see another characteristic. They have 2 pairs of these net-veined wings. So that's what this pattern is here. With the front pair being much larger. So this is the front pair of wings, and this is the hind pair. And when at rest, the mayfly's wings stick up vertically like this. They don't lay back along its back. And they have a long, thin abdomen and these 2 short, bristly antennae. So you can see it pretty well here. And you're all seeing this cursor very well? Okay, and please feel free to stop me if you have any questions or if I'm going too fast. This is going to be a question at the end, and I think it's more the ID type. So the Ephemeroptera, or the mayflies, they exhibit incomplete metamorphosis, which is otherwise known as hematabolous metamorphosis, where they lack a pupal stage, essentially this nymph stage, which is like the immature aquatic stage here. So after they hatch, they look fairly similar to adults. They simply lack wings, but they will have a pad that where the wings will develop. So this life cycle, they start as an egg, and that egg is laid in water. And then they have a nymph stage where they go through several molts, increasing in size each time. Again, this is an immature aquatic stage. And they'll live several years in this stage under rocks or in decaying vegetation or in sediment within streams. The next stage is this sub-imago stage. So this is, it's still not sexually mature, but at this stage, so it's sexually immature, I should say, to be more clear. It leaves the water. It has wings, but it's a very poor flyer at this point. And it's very vulnerable to predation by fish and perhaps other organisms like birds, but we're really focusing on fish. And this is a very short stage, so essentially it'll turn into a mature adult right after that, and the adults do not feed at all. So we're talking, when we are referring to its feeding stage or its feeding guild, we're talking more about the nymph stage. But the adults don't live very long at all, approximately a day, and they're really just alive to reproduce at this point. So you can see this is the life cycle. The egg is deposited in the water by the female after being fertilized. It will survive in the stream for several years, depending on species. and then it'll move out of the stream and cling to like a harder structure, like a rock or a tree, and then eventually become a mature adult, and shortly thereafter it will die.
Just to add to that, so it
Oh.
usually happens in May. And
Yes.
so if you guys have ever been like to a gas station around May near a lake, sometimes you'll see just like swarms of insects, and usually that's mayflies. And if you're doing any sort of fish sampling in that period of time, the hatching events all happen at once. And so it kind of turns into this gigantic cloud. And so these insects can be really important food for different individuals. So thinking like smallmouth bass, you'll find a lot of mayflies in their stomachs at that period of time.
Yes, it's a huge amount, like a boost for as food resources go for fish. And it does actually contribute significantly to transferring certain nutrients from the aquatic system to terrestrial systems as well, due to predation by other species. In tap water, I mean, I don't know. So Bennett asked a question, would it be possible for nymph or egg stage to be present in tap water?
So
They're pretty sensitive. A lot of tap water is treated with chlorine, and they're very sensitive to pollutants. I'm not sure what the threshold is for that. It would have to be tap water that's laid out, I would assume, for a long time. You have one in your aquarium.
okay,
Okay.
I actually have a question. So Bennett, is your tap water city water or no?
Yeah, this is back up
Interesting.
and not here.
Interesting. Okay, so it actually can happen if you have a water system that is fed by a stream. So I have seen that happen. So I don't know what West Virginia laws are like with tap water, but in New York, sometimes you can actually do stream fed tap water for your home. And sometimes then you get some weird things in there. But usually city water is treated and filtered with chlorine and things like that. So you shouldn't have that issue. But if you ever like took your tank out, maybe that could be something.
Now that
That
you
would
say
do
that,
that.
I do think they take the input from a stream in a reservoir, so it might be that.
Potentially.
I know that also, like a lot of the additives you might add to tap water when you put it in an aquarium, take out like the chlorine and things.
Yeah, I don't think that's it.
So, I mean, if you left it outside or something and it happened to get, eggs deposited in it, maybe, but
I mean,
I
that's a
don't
really
know.
cool thing to happen though.
Yeah, it is cool. Yeah, got a whole terrarium going. So the next one we're going to talk about is Plecoptera. So these are your stoneflies. So plico would mean folded. So they have two pairs of wings, and I guess it doesn't show in this picture. They will be folded back when at rest. And some lack wings, but we're not really going to cover those. That's just a very small amount of species that do that. So these are mainly predators, although some species do feed on other things, but a predator in this case is a macroinvert that feeds on other immature macroinvertebrates. So the key identification is this one only has two tail filaments and they're segmented. So you can kind of see that in this picture, well, you see these little bumps here. And they have three pairs of legs, each with two hooks. So I blew this one out. So you can see it has these three pairs of legs, and on the end are two hooks here. And then the front wings are more narrow than the hind wings. So you can see that in, they're also a little longer, I guess, but really just the narrowness of those wings compared to the hind wings. And again, these guys, even at the adult stage, are very poor flyers. They have these long, thin antennae and a long, somewhat dorsoventrally flattened body. So dorsoventrally means like top to bottom. And these guys, again, also require clean, well-oxygenated water to survive. So they're very sensitive to pollutants. And again, they have this very similar life cycle. So they also exhibit incomplete metamorphosis. So the nymph stage will resemble the adult stage, except it mainly lacks wings. The eggs are laid directly in the stream by the female, and this time they are kind of in a sac instead of just being more free floating, I guess, or individual eggs. So the nymph stage, depending on species, which is aquatic again, will last from anywhere from 3 months to 3 years, and it goes through between 12 and 23 molts, increasing in size each time. And this is the stage in which they're really sensitive to pollutants. And again, the stage in which they're feeding. So they kind of skip this subimango state and just go straight to being adults. And the adults will only survive a few weeks to a few days, or a few days to a few weeks, rather. So they're a little bit longer lived. Generally, the adults do not feed, but some adults do feed if it's a particular species. And in those cases, the adults are more herbivores. And this third one, the Trichoptera, are our caddisflies. So trichos means hair, and you might look and see here they have these kind of tiny little silky hairs on them. So they have these hair-covered wings. And the caddisfly, I think I removed that. Caddis actually comes from like an old 15th century word for silk, which would refer to both these silky hairs on their wings, but also these cases when they have at their immature pupal stage that are made out of silk. So these guys would be scraped. They really can, depending on species, occupy almost any of the feeding guilds, but primarily they're scrapers, collector-gatherers, or shredders. And they'll consume periphyton, so this is algae associated with flora and fauna, both aquatic and terrestrial vegetation. So the key identification characteristics, they have these long hair-like antennae, which are as long as the body or longer. They have 2 pairs of wings with those silky hairs on it that I mentioned earlier. 3 pairs of legs, which are all up on the upper third of the body, and paired spurs on each tibia. So let's see.
I'm gonna just talk real quick.
Yeah.
So caddisflies are actually, if you get one in your sample, one, you're gonna get really excited because they usually have a case on them and they're usually very intricate. And 2, they're really distinct because of these like legs kind of collected right up at the top. Caddisflies are actually collected from the wild and used for art and jewelry currently. So I included this picture down here at the bottom to kind of give you an example of that. That caddisfly was actually given gold and pearls and things like that. And so they've been using them to do some art inspired jewelry. So thought that was pretty cool to kind of connect, you know, contemporary world with aquatic macroinverts, because it's not something you would typically think of.
Yeah, and often when they build these silk cases, they incorporate, here you can see a lot of sediment. This one looks like it might have incorporated just little bits of organic matter, but this really just helps to stiffen it up and make it stronger to help protect them.
What other purpose do you think besides protection does this apply, like give them?
Mate selection.
Not necessarily, because you're leaving it behind.
Yeah, and remember, this is the pupal stage, so they're not sexually mature. I guess we'll go over this in the next slide, but they'll be sexually mature when they're up here in this adult stage here.
Though I really do think they're pretty.
Yes.
So what other thing could this provide if you're
So-
using the ingredients from your environment?
By protection, do you mean like physical protection?
Yes,
So like would camouflage be a different thing, or would that also technically be protection?
that's exactly what I was going for. So yeah, camouflage. So unlike a snail, right, when we're looking at a snail, like we know what the shape of the shell looks like. They're really easy to see. Caddisflies won't be really easy to see because they've incorporated small rocks, bits of leaves, all into this casing. And so it helps them blend in with the environment because most of their body is actually mush. So if you're looking at this picture, that lighter portion of the body is very soft compared to this very, very hard head. And so it protects them, and then the camouflage aids in that protection.
Yeah, so these guys are actually pretty closely related to Lepidoptera, which are your moths. And it's probably pretty easy if you're not an expert, which I'm not, to confuse them with those because they do kind of have that like grub or caterpillar like juvenile stage, although these guys are aquatic in their pupal stage. And then when they come out, they as adults, often they're active at night and they are attracted to light just like moths. So there's a lot of similarities in that case, or in that sense, rather.
Are these guys the same as bagworms? Or is that a completely different, like a separate order? You're muted, Kay.
Separate, sorry. I
Okay.
didn't realize I was muted, yeah.
Because I know they also do the weird sewing thing for protection. I want to know if they're connected.
Yeah, and again, these guys have, there's some other species that don't exactly make cases. They might spin a web underwater, and those would be your collector gatherers. So this web that they would spin kind of between rocks or some sort of woody debris or vegetation would collect detritus or whatever, might get washed downstream from your shredders or what have you. So as opposed to the earlier two that we focused on, these exhibit complete metamorphosis. So the eggs are sometimes laid like right above the water on a hard surface. Then they have an actual, oh, there's animations. Thank you, Kay. Yeah. Typically above the water line. And then the larvae have like this soft grub-like body with the hard head, which might extend a little further back. They fall from the vegetation and then they build their case with silk and they'll live in the water. Yeah, so they might have a case that attaches to a submerged structure, like in this picture here. Sometimes they build more of a domed case and they'll move around some. And then the adults, they live about a month feeding on nectar from various plants. These are sexually mature and begin reproducing immediately as soon as they emerge from their cocoon. So I should mention there's this larval stage. So I guess, yeah, this pupa stage is what she was referring to. So they'll actually seal up this case and make a cocoon. And they'll actually undulate their body while inside that cocoon because the cocoon is porous and they'll still need to circulate water through it. So by undulating their body within that cocoon, they're helping to circulate water through it so that they can still respire as they grow and develop. And then they'll emerge from the water and become adults. And yeah, as I said earlier, they're mostly nocturnal. And again, they're weak flyers, so they're a pretty easy food source for fish or other organisms. And again, these larvae are very sensitive to pollutants.
So evolutionarily, the pupa form, right? You would think, oh, well, if you are sensitive to predation, right? Why wouldn't you just form a harder body over time? right? Why wouldn't it just select for a harder body? But because it has this pupa stage, it actually needs that soft body because it needs the osmosis between the water and its skin. So that way it can get oxygen and things like that. Just to explain a little reason why, that is important for this species.
Yes. Yeah, I'm gonna give it back to Kay here.
Okay, so crayfish. Not everyone's like first exciting macroinvertebrate that they think about, but I have come to really love them. So I do actually biomonitoring on the Stony River to understand acid mine drainage in the system. They've restored it. And so we basically look at different crayfish species that they have translocated there to understand how the system's doing, right? Is Dominion Power really doing their job when they're saying they're going to bio-restore this stream that they've impacted with acid mine drainage? So in general, crayfish will eat a wide variety of items. So they'll eat small fish, decaying organisms, other macroinvertebrates. Actually, when we capture crayfish, the way that we do it is we take minnow traps and we put chicken parts that I buy from Kroger in the traps, and then we put them out in the stream for a few hours, and I come back and usually they are covered with crayfish, which is pretty cool to see, kind of gross when you're handling it. Crayfish are not just one entity. They're actually a wide range of species. We have a lot of different species here in West Virginia, and they have a variety of ecomorphs. So unlike, let's say, a smallmouth bass, where you can look at the pattern on it and kind of understand like, oh, this is a smallmouth bass compared to, let's say, a spotted bass or a largemouth, where you're looking at mouth size. Crayfish can be more complex because depending on their environment and our incomplete understanding of variation between systems, their coloration can vary. It also varies in certain species with age. As I wanted to really make clear, they're not always a sign of bad water quality. I think they get a bad rap. A lot of our common species can handle a lot of bad water quality, but some of our more rare species actually do require pretty pristine conditions. There's a variety in their life history cycles. So some are cave dwelling and only cave dwelling, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Most of them have some sort of burrow or burrowing stage. Some will stay burrowed their entire life. You'll never see them actually on the surface, which is pretty cool. And they can exist in a variety of substrates depending on the species. So I really want to focus you guys on two genuses in particular, so Chimbaras. When I'm looking at a crayfish, when I pick it up, the first thing I look at is its rostrum. So if you guys can see my mouse, what I am referring to is this circle in red. Okay. And so I blew that up, and these are actual pictures that I took while I was out sampling. So I'm using these to inform myself later of what species they were. And what genus they were. So you can see there, it has a very smooth edge. It almost looks like a leaf, right? And so there's no points. It just kind of smooths up like this. You'll see it's very different for the other genus. And then I'm also looking at the male gonopods. So gonopods are the reproductive organs of the males. That's the picture that I use, but I brought up a picture from one of the manuals that makes it look a little bit clearer. So you can see that it's at that 90-degree angle. It almost looks like if you were to draw a crab claw from memory, you would draw something like that. And so there's two species that I see often, the Appalachian brook crayfish. And then we actually just saw for the first time this year, the rock crayfish in that system, which is really cool. It could have been overlooked in the past, or it was a bait bucket introduction. But for this system, which was completely wiped out due to acid mine drainage, seeing some of that natural variation kind of move back in is a really big step. Things clear there, or did I go a little too fast? We good? Okay. Okay, Alex, I need the mouse. Yeah. Okay, so the other one I want to go over is Faxionis. So this used to be Oroconnectes. And then the genus was actually split. So this is one of your questions. The reason why it was split was due to some dwelling in caves versus some dwelling on the surface. And this is a really recent change. So this happened, I believe, in 2017. And so if you guys are ever looking through literature or old guides, you will still see Oroconnectes instead of Faxionis. So I wanted to kind of make you aware of that. It's a change that if you're reading literature can get things pretty confusing. And so I have two that I find quite often. Luckily, we don't have it in this system, but we've had it in systems in the past. But the rusty crayfish, so that's an invasive species that is actually outcompeting a lot of our endemic species here in West Virginia, in part because they are very, very aggressive. They've actually been known to compete with even larval smallmouth bass for resources. And so what the rusty crayfish will do is actually basically chase the other crayfish out of any sort of hiding spot and take it over itself. And they can do a lot of damage to an ecosystem pretty quickly. And then the other one that I see that's endemic is the Allegheny crayfish. And once again, I'm pointing you to that rostrum. So in the top picture, you can kind of see it there, and I tried to blow it up, but it's pointy. So it comes to the point at the top, it comes to 2 points at the sides, and it comes back down. And that's how you know it's Faxionis, as well as the male gonopods. So the male gonopods are a lot longer and thin and slender. Almost if you guys have ever seen a fiddler crab claw, like their weaker claw is usually thin and slender. There's new evidence actually that just came out within the past month or two that crayfish are capable of crossbreeding. And now we have crossbreeding individuals with rusty crayfish. And not just one-way crosses, right? Where you have a male and a female and they breed, and then you have a sterile individual, but then that individual that they bred can actually go back and continue to breed, which will have interesting consequences later on when we start to think about conservation of these endemic crayfish as the rusty crayfish continues to expand. Any questions about that? Cool. So I did attach a Maryland guide that I think is pretty good for looking at crayfish if you guys are interested. It's kind of my hobby now where I pick them up in the stream. It's a little bit dated, so it doesn't have Faxionis in it, but it's the best one that I have with pictures. So it has a lot of these like gonopod differences. When I'm differentiating between species, I'm usually looking at very, very small characteristics. And so that guide has a lot of really good pictures of those very particular differences. Any questions on that?
What were you calling the claw?
The gonopods.
Gonopod?
Yeah, so
I just didn't see it on the slide anywhere, so I didn't know how to spell it.
Yeah, Gonopods, gonopods. Yeah, and what that does is that just helps in the transfer of sperm from males to females.
And what's the pointy little horn thing called?
The rostrum.
Okay, thanks.
R-O-S-T-R-U-M, rostrum.
Sorry, I think I'm still confused. What is the G one?
Gonopods.
And that is the...
Here, Alex, can you go back for me, please? Yeah, so that is the big red circle there. So that is the male sexual organ.
Okay.
And so if you're looking at B here, that is just it removed. So that way you can see the actual shape of the gonopod between the two different genuses. So this one is really thin and slender, but then if you go back.
You should have control.
Okay, it wasn't working at first. If you go back,
There's a little lag.
Yeah, you see that this one is at 90 degrees. Can you see the difference now?
Like the
claw itself.
Okay, yeah. Gotcha.
So,
I didn't know what you're talking about was 90 degrees. So yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah, so your claw is at 90 degrees here. For your Cambarus, for your Faxionis, it's like up like this.
Okay.
Usually the rostrum is enough to tell the difference. You don't usually have to look, But the gonopod becomes really important when you start looking at different species, because there is variation between species within this genus. So it's good for you to, if you ever decide to do some crayfish studies, to get really familiar with looking at gonopods, as well as there's some slight differences in the bumps on their claws that you would then look at and things like that. That guide is really, really good if you guys are interested. It'll tell you all the very specific details.
Can you spell the name for the clause that you were saying?
Yeah, so it's GONOPODS. It's a fun one to say.
Thank you.
Not a problem.
Actually, one more thing is, why did the Faxionis name change again? I know what it changed to, but
yeah, so it changed because of a difference between cave dwelling individuals and surface dwelling individuals. And so they wanted to have that difference recognized.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to take over for a minute. So when talking about feeding guilds, it's just simply a way to group organisms by how they feed. And you can probably fit these to fish and other organisms. Here, I kind of had macro inverts in mind when I created this. And I haven't used these for fish necessarily. But you have first your shredders, which feed on large organic matter, so leaves and twigs, and they turn them into smaller organic particles, which will be fed on by your collector gatherers. So these are your organisms. They're going to break it down even further, and they'll find that on the bottom of the stream generally. And then your scrapers here will feed on diatoms and algae. They're attached to underwater surfaces. Filterers, they feed by straining small organic particles out of the water. So these are your more even smaller particles. And the filters on these could be like fan-like structures on an insect's body, or they could be built externally to resemble little underwater nets. Did you take my mouse? Did you need it? Come up, add some. And again, then your predators are just your macro, they will feed on other macroinvertebrates. Fish, you have predators that would feed on macroinvertebrates, but again, it'd be a wider group. So when I put this up above, just know that those are feeding on macroinvertebrates. So in a healthy stream, you would probably have aquatic organisms, generally macroinvertebrates, that occupy all of these roles, these feeding groups. And then an impaired streams, it might be indicated if you don't have at least one of these, or if you're missing multiple. That'd be a way to tell if your stream is potentially impaired. So the next topic, if there's no questions about that. The next topic I'm going to talk about is just some fish that are common in West Virginia. These are freshwater fish, and they're not exclusive to West Virginia by any means, but they are fish. They're pretty common here. So I'm going to introduce the family, and this is going to be a slide you might want to look back to when we get to the quiz at the end, which is not really a quiz, it's part of your problem set. So it's Cyprinidae. So these are your true minnows, used to be the name, or they're your minnows. They also include your carps, and your Asian carps. They're divided in 3 subfamilies. I didn't really want to go into that much detail. Most what we're going to be talking about are the minnows today. And these have 1 dorsal fin. They have their pelvic fin kind of back here in the abdominal position, rather. That's the anal fin. I put the arrow. Actually, I moved this, I think. I'm sorry about that, guys. This is the pelvic fin right here. That's the anal fin. So this is in the abdominal position, so kind of in the middle. They don't have any spines in any of their fins. They have these cycloid scales. So cycloid scales are kind of soft and flexible. They're kind of one of the most common scales you'll see. They overlap and grow with the fish, and you'll get these growth rings in them. And they often shed these as well. And then again, they have no teeth in their jaws, but they do have pharyngeal teeth. So these are kind of back in their throat here, you might see. And this is just what they look like when they're extracted. So Cyprinidae is the largest fish family in the world. It's approximately 2,000 species, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. And these are all freshwater fish. And it's fairly diverse. So within that, I'm just going to cover two. So this is your central stone roller, Campostoma anomalum. So again, genus and species, Cyprinidae is the family. And these are herbivorous, or grazing minnows. So they'll scrape algae off of rocks and logs with this cartilaginous lower lip. They have a really hard cartilaginous lower lip. And that's a pretty distinctive characteristic for them. So that is also the first ID characteristic here. It's kind of horseshoe shaped, you might notice. So it kind of curves like this. And it's inferior or subterminal. So you can see kind of in this picture, it's pointing down, right? And that's again because they're feeding kind of off bottom surfaces. Occasionally they may feed on insects, but mainly they're feeding on algae. They have these irregular dark patches of scales along their sides. And then so in breeding males, they have generally these orange fins. And you can see they have like this dark, so this is the dorsal fin down here. I didn't have a whole lot of room up there. They have this dark band. It's really prominent on the dorsal fin. And it's also present, so I blew up the anal fin. On the anal fin, again, this is the pelvic fin. Anal fin is like back here laying flat. I blew it up for you, and it also has that dark band. It's not as prominent. And they'll also have these tubercles on their head and a little bit back on the nape, so right behind the head. And they extend past the eye, so these are these little bumps here.
So I want to make it clear, tubercles are only when like during the breeding season. So it's not all the time.
Yeah, these are breeding males. Yeah. Yes. So they're commonly found in like riffles and pools of moderate to high gradient streams. So kind of like your, they need a bit of current, and they like the gravel substrate. And they are actually, as opposed to a lot of macroinvertebrates we talked about, very tolerant. So they can be found in almost any stream where there's enough food to support them.
So to actually build upon the acid mine drainage stuff that I was talking about before, we find astronomical numbers of stone rollers in that system, just to show how tolerant the species is. Conductivity can get very, very, very high, and we were still able to catch easily 60,000 in 100 meter, 600 in the entire 1,000 meter stream that we did. So they breed like crazy, and as long as they have algae to eat off of, they can get very large. So just think about that, and when you're thinking about like how tolerant the species can be.
Yeah. So this is another one. This is probably like one of the most common ones we find, the black-nosed dace, Rhynictes atraculus. It's in our stream surveys. Within our lab, we do headwater streams surveys. So the dace comes from an old French word for dars, which means to dart, and that refers to its swimming style. These feed on small insects and other invertebrates, sometimes algae and worms and young crayfish, but mainly small insects, generally the immature stages. So the key identifying characteristic I always use, so this is the caudal peduncle. It's this bone right here before the caudal fin or its tail. So it'll have this dark black line, sometimes with like a reddish band along the side of it that extends from the caudal peduncle all the way up past the eye to the tip of the snout. So you can see that here. So they're fusiform, which means kind of like tapering, kind of like a football, but a little bit thinner in this case. They have kind of a subterminal mouth, so not terminal or not inferior, not pointing straightly down, but and not directly out, but like kind of at an angle, angling down. Again, since it's Cyprinidae, it only has one dorsal fin. It has 8 rays. These are soft rays, not spines. The belly is generally a lighter color, whereas the back is dark. The belly can be white, kind of golden or black. And to distinguish this from, like, say, the long-nosed dace, you might look at the nose. It just barely overhangs this lower jaw. There's a long-nosed dace, which I refer to often as a gonzo fish, has its nose that goes way out over the lower jaw. The next family, this is a much, well, it's not more diverse, that's for sure. But there's some saltwaters, or, well, they all spawn in freshwater. Some will go out to saltwater. This is Salmonidae. So the key thing, and this is like a dead giveaway for them, is they have this adipose fin. There's other species that have it, but all of Salmonidae have this adipose fin. So this is different from the dorsal fin. The dorsal fin is like kind of membranous. It has these soft rays, and then it's like strung together by a membrane. But the adipose fin is a lot, if you ever look at it, it's a lot thicker. It's kind of fatty. And it's like kind of used to help detect current and navigate. The pelvic fins are more towards the back. So they're also kind of more abdominal rather than thoracic, which would be up here. They have, again, no spines in any of their fins, and the jaw extends past the eye in all of these as well. They're very smooth.
So I bet a lot of you guys have experience with this family. But for those people that don't, Salmonidae tends to have really complex life histories. So they move up into freshwater systems, they lay their eggs, and they head back out to sea, or they die, depending on the species. And you can have, even within the species, a lot of complexity. So you have resident individuals and migrant individuals. And so they've attracted a lot of research attention, as well as they are beloved fish by anglers. So that's kind of why we introduced them here. I expect that, one second, most of you guys have some sort of experience with them, especially brook trout. I know Bethany and Lucas would probably be tired of hearing me talk about brook trout. So I just want to give you guys like a little bit of the cover about what he was talking about with like freshwater versus saltwater, for people that don't know.
Yes. So if you're tired of talking about brook trout, that's too bad, because we're going to do it again. So brook trout, obviously here in West Virginia, pretty much the main sport fish. They feed on kind of the larval and pupal stages when they're young, in the adult aquatic insects more when they're adults. But the adults will also just basically go after anything they can get in their mouth. Primarily, they feed on aquatic insects, though. So for the brook trout, that you might want to look, they have these light spots on more of a dark background. So you can see that pretty clearly here. These spots, I guess this is a little more clear. These spots, these light spots on the dark background. And then there's no teeth on their vomer. So I put this in here, and I didn't want to go in too much to the anatomy, but you have the palatine arch kind of up here where they do have some teeth. And then you have the vomer right here, and it doesn't have any teeth in brook trout. So this is Salvelinus frontinalis. They have this kind of worm-like pattern you can see pretty clearly here on their back. And then these lower fins have this white leading edge. Of course, because they are Salmonidae, they have the adipose fin, which you can see here and here. And they don't have any spines in any of their fins.
And I just want to make clear, those are breeding colors. So females will not be quite as bright and vibrant.
So to contrast, the rainbow trout, Oncorhinus micus, has these dark spots on a light background. The spots extend onto the caudal fin, so it's widely spotted. So caudal fin or tail. And then they also extend past the eye to the nose. They do have those teeth on the vomer, you can see here. And again, they have the adipose fin and no spines in any of their fins. And I believe these are introduced, right?
Yeah, so these are invasive. We stock them in a lot of, because people like them, right? We like fishing big fish. Also, West Virginia stocks a golden version of this. So gold rush trout, has anyone here caught that? Yeah, they're my favorite. I caught one actually by hand this past season. And so basically they are the albino version of a rainbow trout. And so we stock them to attract tourists as something novel that they can catch here.
Okay. And again, these guys feed primarily on aquatic insects, but the adults will go after anything they can get in their mouth, generally anything that's up to like maybe a third of its body length. So also like fish eggs, terrestrial insects, but small fish as well, and crayfish on occasion if they can get them. So I wanted to include this. So this is the long-nosed gar, Lepiastrus osseus. It's kind of one of my favorites because it has a lot of these really cool ancestral characteristics. It has what you'd call an abbreviated heterocercal tail. Generally, the other fish we were talking about, the tailbone would go straight here and end. But here it's like slightly asymmetrical. The tailbone actually goes up and has this large lobe here. And then they also have these these rhomboid shaped ganoid scales. These are pretty cool. They don't overlap at all, and they're not exactly very flexible. But they have ganoin, which is kind of an enamel-like substance that makes them really hard, like an armor. And they have this really distinctive, so this is also called a rostrum. It's like a beak-shaped mouth, and it's full of tiny little villiform teeth, sharp teeth. So these guys are predators. They're ambush predators. They feed on small fish, minnows, sunfish, shad. And you might notice they have their dorsal fin, instead of being up here, as we've seen in most species, it's way back towards the caudal tail, and also its anal fins back there, and these are both kind of large. And that really gives them a lot of burst speed. It gives them a lot more surface area near the tail, so they'll kind of hang out rather than cruise around, and when they see something, they'll burst out and grab it. So yeah, things to look for is this long, sharply toothed beak-like jaw. So this is the long-nosed gar. So this rostrum is going to be greater than the distance of the length of the rest of the head. So the head would end right about here. And you can see it's clearly much longer than that. So it's about 2 times as long, sometimes maybe longer. And again, has those rhomboid shaped scales in the abbreviated heterocercal tail. But these first two are generally like what I would use. Like if you see this is probably a gar in this system, and if the jaw is this too much times longer than the rest of the head, it's a long nose gar.
So, Ryan, I saw your question. You were asking about the tail and why it's a circle. Okay, so when you're looking at the body shape of a fish, the fin placement and the fin shape usually corresponds with its movement style and generating, because it's moving in a much more viscous space, right? Air, we're able to move freely. We don't feel a wave come off of us, right? Yeah, exactly. But fish, they actually have to generate, they try to generate waves around themselves to break the tension so that way they can move faster. And so that's what that tail allows them to do. It generates enough, I'm trying to think of the exact word, but think of it like small
Like
vortexes.
propulsion?
Yes, it has to do with propulsion, but it creates small vortexes that allows it to propulse itself more efficiently, because you're moving through a more viscous liquid. You're trying to move the fastest you can for the lifestyle that you have while using the least amount of energy.
Yeah. And
fish bodies are adapted to do that. Like if you're thinking about a tuna, and a tuna has a like a C-shaped tail.
Yeah, very crescent shaped.
Very crescent shaped. What that tail does is it allows it to generate vortexes around its body for it to maintain the speed that it needs to catch its prey and breathe, and then without like over expending energy.
Yeah, and another advantage to this particular tail shape. So if you're familiar at all with sharks, they have, instead of the abbreviated, they have like the heterocircle. So the other alternative would be the homocircle, where it is it just goes straight out, so and it's completely symmetrical. Here it's more or less symmetrical unless you don't have a good picture. Like if you look at the caudal peduncle, that'll be asymmetrical. But like with a shark, this extends all the way to the end of the top of the caudal fin. And I imagine this provides a little bit of the same. So what this does is it's a little stiffer up top and a little looser in the bottom. And so you can see, since this is an ancestral trait, also this is like more of a primitive fish, its pectoral fins are located more down towards the lower portion of its body. Whereas if we're looking at a more modern fish, so say a perch or something, the pectoral fins would be up here, or a largemouth bass, they'd be up here, and that would give them a lot more ability to like maneuver. They might just kind of paddle like this with those fins and be able to turn direction really easy and maintain their elevation. They might have a gas bladder as well. But this basically means that the tail is going to sweep back and forth like this, giving it a little bit more lift, which they're not getting as much lift with these fins. So it's going to help them stay level and maintain their position in the water column as well.
And to clarify, primitive does not mean not adapted well, right?
Yes.
So like,
yeah, these guys have been around for a long time,
Yeah. So sometimes we misconstrue primitive as like, oh, it's old, so it's not as good. But they've been around for so long because their bodies are able to persist and they're very tolerant and things like that. So
yes, very much so.
Very cool.
These guys, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say very cool. So when you were talking about, Kayla, when you were talking about how they're trying to create vortices, is that kind of what that, especially with how it's loose on the bottom of the caudal fit of the tail, does that increase the vortice because it's loose and it's not like as rigid?
Basically, it'll just help it maintain kind of some lift. So like if you think of like an airplane wing, like if it's tilted, it's going to go a little bit faster underneath than it is over. You're going to have this vortice here. It's like a little suction, maybe like pulling it up. So it's going to swim like this a little instead of like this if it was a homocircle tail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the vortices, if you've ever like gone canoeing or kayaking, and you know, like you're pulling your paddle through the water, and you see like that spiral, that is what's happening with fish, but on a very, very microscopic level. And so to measure that, we do experiments actually with dye in water, watching fish move through like currents and different velocities of water. And so you can actually see those spirals that come off the fish while they're moving with certain fins and the way that it's placed. It's pretty cool. You can look up some videos about it.
Cool.
So I'm gonna briefly cover the river continuum concept. Kay's probably gonna jump in here. Do you want to do these questions first?
So I'm actually going to jump in and just kind of start it off
Go for it.
with a little bit of the history. So the river continuum concept was actually created by Robin van Noot. And when this hit like science and freshwater science, it was like, boom, like it attracted a lot of people to the conference. Everyone was like pouring into the room, and it was really, it emphasized for the first time that a system is functionally linked. So prior to the river continuum concept, it was described that people that study freshwater ecosystems studied their 100-meter stretch of water, and that was it. They didn't consider what was going on upstream. They didn't consider what was going on downstream. And so it really pushed us to study systems at a watershed level. Are you guys familiar with the term as watershed? Everyone, or did I lose some people? Okay, iffy. So think of watershed as like a drainage basin. Okay, so if I have my cup here, right? You have all these rivers that come down off the side, and they collect into one main one in the center, and that goes out to sea. So that's what a watershed is. And so it was the beginning of thinking about how streams higher up in the watershed are connected to the streams lower in the watershed. So it's a hypothesis, right? And so a hypothesis doesn't mean that it is true everywhere. But what it began to do was it related biological and chemical processes to the physical attributes of the system. So now we're beginning to look at the geomorphology, right? And how does the geomorphology impact the energy dynamics in the system? And how does that shape the community as a whole? And so we were finally able to see trends by using just this general hypothesis, and then begin to figure out, okay, so why is this system different from another? And I posed that question to you guys a few times, people that are looking at specific rivers or specific ecosystems. What makes your system your system? And so that question has really kind of bounded off of this theory. So Alex, do you want to go into what the theory is itself? We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. So this is trying to integrate kind of all the physical and biological processes that change as you go from the headwater streams down to the mouth of a river. So kind of in the headwater areas, the stream's gonna be a much steeper gradient, and there's gonna be a lot more, it's narrower, there's a lot more overhanging vegetation. So there's gonna be less light reaching the river, which means less photosynthesis. But there's gonna be a lot of organic matter dropping in, so twigs and leaves and things into the river, which is gonna mean that this area is gonna be kind of dominated by your shredders and collectors, with just some few grazers and few predators as well. And the predators are going to be kind of present all throughout. And as you go downstream, the river widens out a little more, so there's more sun actually reaching the river. There's
I'm just
the-
gonna add to that
yeah, go ahead.
description of like the headwater stream. So your headwater stream is going to be a lot more narrow.
Mhm.
Okay. And so you have your groundwater inputs. And so your groundwater inputs are actually going to impact your stream a lot more than when you're further downstream. So that's why headwater streams tend to be cooler. They tend to support fish like our brook trout that we love so much because it's cooler and they like cool water, right? And so in these systems, you're not going to have like long stretches necessarily of the same habitat unit, but you're going to have a lot of falls and a lot of riffles, and they're going to happen in quick succession. So you'll have maybe a 100-meter riffle breaks up into a pool, which then breaks up into a fall. And so you have a lot of habitat heterogeneity along the longitudinal axis of the stream.
Yes, thank you. So these mid-gradient streams, again, so they're not as steep. So the water is flowing a little bit slower. You have fewer riffles in falls. The stream's wider, so you don't have trees completely covering it usually, which means there's more sunlight reaching the water, which means more aquatic plants, rooted aquatic plants can grow. Insects there's gonna be more insects feedings on aquatic algae. So you can notice here we have a lot more grazers than we had previously and a lot fewer shredders. We still probably have same amount of proportion of collectors and similar proportion of predators. But there's gonna be a greater diversity of invertebrates and fish. And again, the groundwater is gonna be less influential here. And the stream's gonna be generally warmer because the sun can get at it.
Yeah, so adding to that, thinking about your energy, right? And so in the handout, I mentioned energy. A lot of the energy for the basis of the headwater system is coming from your coarse particulate matter that is coming in from the terrestrial system.
Mhm.
As you hit that mid-water reach and then move further into, your farther water reaches, excuse me, I need some more water. You are going to see less influence of that terrestrial and more influence of the system within itself producing energy. Okay, so then that's when you start to enter into periphyton. So that's your macroalgae are beginning to form. And so the basis of your energy system will begin to be in the actual water itself. Does that make sense? Because really, we have to remember that primary producers fuel everything else. And so in the headwater systems, that coarse particulate matter, that fuel is coming from the terrestrial, not necessarily within the system.
Yes. So then we're going to get down to kind of more mouth or the main stem of the river. And in this area, kind of more dissolved organic matter is more important. So you can see we have a lot more collectors, so filters as well, about the same amount of predators. So phytoplankton and zooplankton contribute most of the food base, along with the dissolved organic matter from the floodplain and from what's getting broken down. There's a bit more turbidity, so there's going to be potentially a less amount of aquatic vegetation, except for in maybe some kind of off-channel areas where turbidity can settle and it's shallow. There's also going to be fewer sight feeders because of the turbidity, but there's going to be a lot more fish present that are omnivores or plankton feeding fish such as carp, suckers, and paddlefish sometimes.
So this is really where your DOM becomes important. So your dissolved organic matter.
Mhm.
So that is kind of the little particles that are floating around that are organics that your zooplankton, right, would be feeding off of, bacteria, things like that. And then to build off of kind of what we were thinking about earlier with habitat heterogeneity, right? So like little small pockets of habitat, as you move down your stream here and you expand, you're going to have more microhabitats in your width area. And so you can have more diversity because you have more habitat complexity, right? So like, as he was talking about those off channels, which might have specific characteristics that may allow a little bit of the mid-channel characteristics to bleed through, individuals can take advantage of that. And so with increasing habitat complexity, you tend to have increases in species composition. Make sense? Okay, cool, because that's a question and I want y'all to get it right.
Okay. So if there's no more questions about this, we're going to move on. I created a little poll for us. We're going to kind of discuss the answers, but these are also, this is the first section of the problem set. So you might want to like kind of look or have it up and fill it out as you go, or just take notes, however is easiest for you, and fill it in later. So let me, hang on. Let me start the poll here. So hopefully you guys are seeing the poll. So this first question, identify the macroinvertebrate. So this is the order. We went over just the 3 orders earlier. So just identify which one that is. Are you guys seeing the poll?
I would just answer question 1 because question 2
just
for the next slide.
Yeah, it has like all 7 questions up at once. So like,
Is it? I've never done the poll. I don't know. Maybe I should have made a separate poll for each question.
I would just aim to answer the first poll, and then as we're going through, you guys can continue to answer all the other questions, and then at the end we'll do like a full understanding. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Cool.
It looks like we can only submit them all at once.
That's okay.
Okay. So just I'll give you a few minutes. If I switch and you're not ready, just let me know. So it looks like we have 100% on that. So you can go to the next one. Again, just what is the order of this macroinvertebrate? I think we got 100% there.
No,
You guys,
Alex, go a bit
Yeah?
slower because it's only 4 people that responded. That's that 100%.
oh.
That's 4 people that submitted. So go a bit slower.
Oh,
so
okay.
people can
Well,
actually
let me
look.
go back. Let me go
Thank you.
back, guys. I'm sorry. You're right. I didn't see that. So
So when we're looking at this, what are we thinking about to identify it?
Like the wings laying back when it's resting,
Yeah.
and the little antennas.
Little antennas, yeah. Antennas are really important to focus on. What other characteristics might be important to think about?
yeah, Lucas commented hairs on body. So that's really good. You can
Yes,
see
that's
there's
a
a
good
lot
one.
of these tiny little hairs.
Okay. Are we good to switch to the next one? Okay.
All right. So it's same question, different order.
Okay, now looking at this one, what are we thinking? What are we focused on? You can be wrong, it's okay. So when I'm looking at macroinvertebrates, the first thing I'm trying to look at is that butt, that end, right? So what kind of tails do we have? Do we have long and thin, or do we have like shorter and segmented, right? And how many do we have? So that's the thing I would focus on here. And then you can kind of see, if you're looking at that back foot, the hooks. So if you guys are taking your pictures, kind of like I do for my crayfish, right? If you guys are doing a study like this, places that you want to take pictures of are your feet, your tails, and if you have like a more immature stage, the gills.
And again, this is an insect that is at rest. So might want to look at how the wings are held.
And you're looking at that one large wing and that one smaller wing. Okay, we good to move on to the next one? Cool.
Okay.
So again, focus on the wings in this one. As well, the tail you can kind of see, but it looks like this one has an egg mass. So
Yeah.
it's kind of, the tail is kind of lifted up. And so it's a little harder to see. But focus on whether or not it's segmented.
Yeah. And again, I found these wings to be I felt like the wings were very distinctive between the 3 orders. So I think that's what I was thinking when I was picking pictures for this. So I'd pay attention to those a lot.
Are we good to move on to the next one? Cool.
So this is a species you guys haven't seen, but I just want you to identify the family that this fish belongs to. What characteristics do you notice?
The dark spots on a light background.
Yep. But again, so that'd be more for like the species level.
Yeah.
That's a good trait. But so remember when I did the fish, I like broke out the family for it and then went down to the species and genus level.
So for this, I would be really focused on your fins.
Mm-hmm.
So where are your fins located? How many, like what fins do we have there?
Mm-hmm. Maybe also the jaw.
Yeah. We good to go to the next one? Cool.
So I kind of blew up the dorsal fin here so you can see, looks like it kind of has soft rays, right? Pelvic fin here. And again, this is a species you haven't seen. But you have seen the family. Now I'll give you a hint. If you chose correctly on the last one, then it's the other one because it's only 50-50.
Okay, we ready to move on?
Okay, you want?
Yep. So what subclass does this belong to? And then just kind of, if you guys can remember it, can you guys like just unmic yourself and tell me the order? You guys go back in your slides. I only give you 2 subclasses. I mean, I only give you 1 subclass for this, but I gave you 2 orders. It's the fun one that I said I can see their antenna for miles. That's a good hint.
Is it the Calanodia?
Yeah. Yeah. Super cool. And if you guys noticed in my pictures that were my own pictures, they were dyed red. That's because we actually dye them to see them in the water samples. This would be a much more representative picture of what they would be like if they were just free swimming. Okay, next one. Okay, So what genus and species is this crayfish? So we're looking at that rostrum again, right? So what kind of rostrum does this have? Just unmic yourself and call it out.
Smooth.
Smooth, yeah. Exactly. So what does this narrow down to?
Cambaris.
Exactly. Then it's the same picture as the one that I already had up there. What you're kind of noticing, and this is kind of a good example because it's larger. I identify this guy as Cambaris batoni as that because of this characteristic here. It almost looks like he weightlifts, right? You see that like little dimple. So I use that little dimple as well as the uniform size of these small ridges on its claws to identify it as Cambaris batoni. Okay. And then I think that is it. So you guys get out a little bit early today, which is exciting. But we're gonna stay around. If you guys want to work on your problem set, that's really cool. I can stay around and answer questions. I also want to do a small plug. So right now we are hiring techs for the summer. It has to be someone who is going to be here next year because you have to be in the system, unfortunately. For seniors, sorry. The techs will be working on our long-term project. So our brook trout project, you can get really familiar with this Salamonidae family if you so choose. And then techs will also be working with me doing some of this crayfish sampling as well as larval fish sampling. So you'd be going out with me. It's about an hour and a half away. We'd be doing a 14-hour night sampling and then coming back in the morning. We'd be doing that about 3 times a month. So my first sampling event is actually this April. And so if you guys are not sure whether or not you want to apply for a tech position, you want to like just get a taste of it or come out with me once, you can't make the full tech commitment, you know, shoot me an email and I can take y'all out with me. It's a fun time. We eat a lot of snacks and just kind of go out and do it. So, all right. And so you guys can leave if you choose or stay around and finish your problem set. Garrett, are you actually there? Megan, Teeny, are you there? Let's see if you want to come out with me to do crayfish stuff.
Oh, sorry. I dropped my laptop and like I'm having issues now. So sorry.
No, you're fine. I wanted to ask you, do you still want to come out and do crayfish stuff?
I'm sorry. What day did you say it would be?
It would just be sometime in April. You can say no. It's okay. I won't be hurt.
I want to. I just have no idea what I'm going to be doing because it seems like every day something new pops up that I have to do.
Okay.
So if you could give me like an exact day, like shoot me an email, I could see if that works.
Yeah. So the way it kind of works with that is I kind of go on the cusp when flows are available. But what I'll do is I'll shoot you an email like either the day of or like 2 days before I think I'm going to head out. And give you like a little bit of a notice and just see if you're free. If that's okay with you.
Yeah, that works great.
Okay, cool. Because I didn't forget that you want to come check that out and it's a fun time. So.
Yeah, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, what's up, Brian?
This is not really about the questions, but
Yeah.
when you were talking about the rainbow trout and you were talking about how you guys help people stock big specimens for
Yeah.
tourism purposes.
Yep.
Um,
So they stock them usually as young a year. They don't usually stock them as large ones, but people like big fish. And so the goal is to stock some of these invasive ones like the rainbow trout. They get really big, people fish them, they protect them because people like to fish them. Yeah.
so they're invasive
They are invasive.
and we stock them.
Yes, we do. And that happens with a lot of salmonids. So actually out west, they stock brook trout because people like to fish them. And they've been invasive in that system since I want to say the mid 1900s, so like probably the 50s, 60s. But they do damage, right? Like they are really decimating cutthroat trout populations, and but there's money there, so people continue to stock them.
Yeah, I think they also introduced them to Lake Erie. I think like they had Cisco or something die off, or I can't remember.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, but they stocked them there, and now they're like trying to go back and not necessarily remove them, but bring up the stock of those other fish.
Yeah, they also introduced Pacific salmon in New York, because they get huge there, and the fishermen love it. So.
Yeah.
Well, that's because
Big fish.
Go around
Big fish. Yeah.
They get big because they have to freaking travel.
But yeah, and they get big because they were not evolved in that system. And usually those systems are compromised. So they are, taking place of another native fish, right? And so they're eating up those resources. That other native fish probably wasn't doing hot to begin with, and then now is doing even worse. And so that's like the open niche hypothesis that that's why invasives do so well.
Because they take up that niche, and if they're better at that niche, then they will take out whatever species is taking up that niche.
Exactly. But it's pretty cool at the same time.
See, like I get the money side of it, but like the whole excitement is that you don't. I don't know, I guess for older fishermen like back in the day, I bet the excitement would be, is this the day? Because they knew that these were very rare, giant.
So actually, the size of fish has been going down over time. And so it's a psychological theory, which is called shifting baselines. And so the baseline that your grandfather had for a big fish is much larger than your baseline. And like 3 generations down the line, will be much smaller than what you have right now. And that's because we have a tendency to overfish the larger individuals. And so that's where a lot of the regulation with different size ranges has come from, because we just kind of went through and we're like, oh, let's take all the big ones out. And then we realized that those big fish are really important because those are usually our most fecund females. Right. So they're able to produce the most eggs, or eggs of the best quality. And so they tend to over contribute to the success of the population.
Yeah. And I would say a lot of these programs were kind of started a long time ago. Like maybe the system wasn't entirely perfectly managed. And we had a fisheries collapse. I know that happened in Lake Erie. They used to have a commercial fishery, and they really did like collapse. I can't remember what species it was. I'm sorry.
There's a few.
Yeah, well, there are a few, but particularly they can't introduce these because those had collapsed. And I think like a minnow species was getting out of hand. So they introduced them to try to balance it out. And then it kind of gains its own inertia, right? Because if you think about local management agencies, they're actually funded by fishing license sales, sometimes sales of gear, tax. And so the fishermen, if they like something, there's a lot of pressure to, keep stocking that and maintain that fishery. So it's a little hard to go against that inertia and try to reestablish a natural ecosystem once it's been established. And it often was established prior to, all the advances we've had in the field now. In our understanding of ecological interactions.
And to build on
things.
that too, Ryan, thinking about the river continuum concept that we just went over, right? Rivers don't stop at state borders.
No,
They don't, right? And so the failures and or successes of your surrounding states are all going to impact that watershed. And so this is a huge issue when we're thinking about the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Because they have a lot of anoxia issues, right? And when you're looking at that system, the Susquehanna drains into it. The Susquehanna starts all the way up, goes down through New York, goes through Pennsylvania, right? And so it transverses a lot of different states. And New York can be doing really well, and they were doing really well for a while with like agricultural inputs into the system. But the second you hit Pennsylvania, if Pennsylvania isn't regulating in the same way, you lose those benefits. So yeah, I there's a lot of, well, mainly me, I'm advocating for different types of agencies that kind of work through those state departments on a watershed basis.
Yeah, and there are a lot. I know, like for Lake Erie, we have the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, which includes even the Canadians. It's actually one for the Ohio River.
Yeah.
But it's also difficult. There's a lot of politics involved in it.
Yeah. And we tend to only do that
it's something we're moving towards, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, we're pushing towards ecosystem management, right?
Yes.
That's like the buzzword. And so if you really want to get a job, say, I'm interested in ecosystem management, because that's the new trendy word.
Well, if you want to get a job, you figure out the trendy word that the person you're interviewing with is interested in.
Which, yeah.
But yeah, it's often that.
With NOAA agencies and stuff like that right now, it's all ecosystem management, which means that you're not just managing for one species, you're managing the entire. Exactly. Which means that you have a large suite of different skills that you can express. And you understand things like zooplankton dynamics and how the individual species characteristics are going to impact your larval fish survival, which are going to, impact the rest of it. So yeah, that's a buzzword if you're looking for something.
So, well, I'm glad to hear that there's there's
something. We're getting somewhere.
Yeah, there's a lot of like intergovernmental cooperation, like we have fisheries resource councils and things, but it doesn't always work perfectly.
And also, to be on part of those fisheries research councils, you don't necessarily have to be a scientist.
Yeah, they generally have like a scientific advisory board, and then they'll have like a separate board for like commercial interests. There might be a third one, and then they'll have like a main council.
Yeah, their main council tends to be made of individuals that are not scientists.
I don't know. That's not true. I mean,
in my experience in the Gulf, that was the case.
Yeah,
and I worked very closely with the legal
advisor. Up in Alaska, my advisor was on that committee, so they do, but not always.
Yeah.
It's not just by any means. Yeah, it's
and
not
I think
just
Alaska is a little unique in that it protects its resources pretty heavily.
Yeah, they're pretty interested in it. Yeah.
Yeah, because like when you're looking at advisory councils, when you head towards California, things get really tense because you have a lot of
they have a lot of conflicting interests.
A lot of conflicting interests, as well as high property values.
Mhm.
that kind of collect together to create
That's
this.
gonna kill them.
Well,
It creates this,
agriculture
That's what's
too.
going down.
yeah,
Agriculture gets into it because there's kind of like water wars going on out there,
yeah.
you know?
It's a big toxic soup.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna hop off, guys, because I'm going to use the restroom before the next class. So
Yeah, I can probably stay on for a few more minutes if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the rainbow trout.
Mhm.
Just this morning in a different class for capstone, they were talking about the rainbow trout don't survive the season. So I was just wondering, is that true, or is it maybe by region, like maybe in Pennsylvania, it's a little bit more north, they can't survive, or what?
Yeah, I'm not like super familiar with that. I know they definitely do survive. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a population that's self-sustaining, which we do. There might be some mortality, some increased mortality. But I think that they do pretty good. I haven't heard that. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe he was referring to some specific system.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, sorry, can't be more clear on that.
No, no problem. Now that you say that, he might have just been talking about put and take, stalking. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely like systems where they might like stock adults or something for the express purpose of just like, you know, just like a single season. I know in Alaska they do what they call terminal fisheries. So uh they'll put salmon out in say like a bay or a harbor or something. Like they did it in Homer, Alaska. They had a little spot off the Spit, which is like just a really narrow peninsula. And then the salmon can't spawn there. They'll go there and then they'll go out and feed and grow and come back, but they can't spawn there. And then it's just like a huge derby. Everyone just goes wild fishing them.
Wow.
But yeah, I'm not super familiar with like brook trout or rainbow trout in that manner, but I do know that they shouldn't have any real issue surviving here season to season. Maybe their mortality is slightly higher because they're not native. And that might be why we have to continuously stock them. But we do have natural reproducing ones, I do believe. They're at least growing and surviving long enough to reach like stock length or be interesting to fishermen. Otherwise, we wouldn't be stocking them, right?
Right.
So they're surviving. Maybe they don't spawn as successfully, but they're surviving to reach adult stages.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.